All right, hello, boys and girls. Sorry I'm not in class today. Had some things that I needed to take care of, but regardless, our class proceeds. I am doing a recording so that you can pretty much be like having today's lesson taught by me. So, the last things that we talked about last week was, of course, our third president, Thomas Jefferson. We went over some of his foreign and domestic policies. And when his presidency is going to come to an end, we are going to get our fourth president, which is going to be Mr. James Madison. Now, our objectives, as I've told you through all the other presidents, starting from Washington, we need to understand the challenges confronted by the government and its leaders in the early years of the Republic. We need to be able to describe any type of domestic or foreign policy that was faced in their presidency. Today, we're going to be explaining the causes, the important events, and the effects of the War of 1812. Now, just because we are not in an actual live session where I am monitoring you on Zoom, I do expect your assignment to be completed at the end of your class time. That means there's no excuse why you should not be turning in your assignment. So some of the vocabulary that we're going to see with James Madison are going to be the Warhawks, members of Congress from the South and the West who called for war with Britain prior to the War of 1812, nationalism, excessive pride in one's nation, Hartford Convention, the gathering of New Englanders to protest the War of 1812 by threatening to secede from the Union, and the Treaty of Ghent. This is going to be a peace treaty that is going to be signed by Britain and the United States at the end of the War of 1812. So let's get started with our 60 seconds of James Madison.
James Madison, and surrounded by legends, his best friend was Thomas Jefferson. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Madison which paper? It's Congress.
All right, so that was a quick 60-second. Now let's listen and watch to a little bit about his biography before we get started on his presidency. And then in the blue box, you are going to be writing in something that you found interesting from the video. So, by listening to his biography, I think there's a lot of important information, stuff that we've already talked about, perhaps other things that you found interesting in that biography. So, go ahead and type in your answer there in the blue box as far as what is something that you found interesting from the biography. All right, so James Madison, boys and girls, he is going to be president of the United States from 1809 to 1817. The most significant series of events during his presidency are going to be those events surrounding by the War of 1812, which is something that we're going to talk about today. Um, just a little bit of insight, either from the video. Um, James Madison is known to be the shortest U.S. president, 5 feet 4. Um, his wife, Dolly, is responsible for saving the famous portrait of George Washington from the burning in the White House when it got attacked by the British during the War of 1812. Something else interesting, or I guess an extra piece of information, is that both of James Madison's vice presidents passed away during their term in office. All right, so James Madison's major problem is going to be the War of 1812. That's going to be our main problem. Remember, he inherited the foreign conflicts that had plagued the presidents before him, and namely the continued threat of armed conflict with Britain and France. Keep in mind that our other presidents that we've talked about have definitely stayed away from war. George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. So now that we're going to get James Madison coming in, unfortunately, we are going to inherit, that conflict that was already established before him, and we're going to get into some conflict ourselves, which is going to be the War of 1812. So these are the groups that had some involvement in the War of 1812. We're going to have the Native Americans, the British, the Americans, the French. It says somebody was bullying the United States during James Madison's presidency. Who was it? James Madison, another Democratic Republican, became president of the United States in 1809. He inherited the neutrality problems President Jefferson faced during his presidency. War with Great Britain was unavoidable. Britain did not really want to go to war with the United States because it was already in another war with France. To try to avoid war, the British announced that they would no longer interfere with American shipping. But the mail system of the day prevented this news from reaching the United States until weeks after war was declared. President James Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war on June 1st, 1812. So Britain, boys and girls, really did not want to go to war because they were still at war with France. But unfortunately, that that letter never reached them, which it was too late by the time they received it that British did not want to keep interfering with the American ships. It says the United States had major problems with France and Great Britain, and there seemed to be no solution to the situation. Fighting with the Native Americans hurt relations between the United States and Britain. The British were supplying guns and ammunition to the Native Americans on the frontier. They also encouraged Indians to attack United States settlements. Meanwhile, the ban on trade with Britain and France expired. Congress authorized President Madison to make a tantalizing offer. If either the British or the French stopped seizing American ships, the United States would reopen trade with that nation. Napoleon quickly announced that France would respect American neutrality. Britain did not respond to the offer. As promised, the United States resumed trade with France, but continued to ban all shipments to or from Britain. So the United States has major problems with the Native Americans too. The Native Americans were angry that many Americans wanted to seize their land. They wanted to take their land. Conflict between American and Native Americans was growing as settlers moved into the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, pushing Native Americans off their land. Two Shawnee Indians, a chief named Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, tried to fight back by uniting Native Americans up and down the Mississippi River into one great Indian nation. On November 7th, 1811, Tecumseh and his warriors fought with a militia force led by the Indiana governor, William Henry Harrison, in the Battle of Tippecanoe Creek. After this battle, Harrison's men found British guns on the battlefield. It says the war hawks call for war. Who are the war hawks? It says while Madison did not want war, other Americans were ready to fight. In New England, anti-war feelings ran strong. However, members of Congress from the South and the West called for war. They were known as war hawks. War hawks were moved by a strong sense of nationalism or love for one's country. War hawks felt that Britain was treating the United States as if it were still a British colony. They were willing to fight a war to defend the Americans' rights. It says the most outspoken war hawk was Henry Clay of Kentucky. Clay wanted to punish the British for seizing American ships. He also hoped to conquer Canada. Also, if Americans went to war with Britain, the Warhawks said the United States could seize Florida from Britain's ally, Spain. They also pointed out that Britain was arming Native Americans on the frontier and encouraging them to attack settlers. The Warhawks felt that winning a war against Britain would bring lasting safety to settlers on the frontier. So the causes of the war. Let's examine those causes. So the first part is going to be the impressment of the United States sailors. It says, for a long time, the United States managed not to get involved in the European wars that followed the French Revolution. At times, the nation even benefited from the conflict. Busy with affairs in Europe, France sold the Louisiana Territory to the U.S., and American shippers eagerly took over trade interrupted by the war. By 1805, the British began to clamp down on U.S. shipping. They did not want Americans to provide their enemies with food and supplies. After the United States threatened to take action, the British decided to set up a partial blockade, and this would only allow some American ships to bring provisions to Europe. This partial blockade angered France, which enacted its own laws to control foreign shipping. These changes put American merchants in a difficult position. If they obeyed the British rules, their ships could be seized by the French. If they obeyed the French rules, their ships could be seized by the British. Britain also interceded with U.S. trade by the impressment or kidnapping of American sailors to work on British ships. Between 1803 and 1812, the British impressed about 6,000 American sailors. One of the most famous incidents occurred in 1807. The British ship Leopard attacked an American naval ship, the Chesapeake, off the coast of Virginia. 3 Americans lost their lives in the battle, and the attack aroused widespread anger. Had Congress been in session, American might have declared war, but Jefferson, who had been reelected in 1804, decided against it. So that's one of our causes. Another one is going to be the interference with American shipping. Instead of declaring war, Jefferson asked Congress to pass legislation that would stop all foreign trade. Remember, with Thomas Jefferson, Congress passed the Embargo Act of 1807. American ships were no longer allowed to sail to foreign ports. The act also closed American ports to the British ships. Jefferson's policy was a disaster. It was more harmful to the United States than to the British and the French. American farmers and merchants were especially hard hit. Southern and Western farmers, for example, lost important markets for their grain, cotton, and tobacco. Shippers lost income, and many chose to violate the embargo by making false claims about where they were going. One New Englander said that the embargo was like cutting one's throat to cure the nosebleed. The embargo became a major issue in the election of 1808. Jefferson's old friend James Madison won the election. By the time he took office, Congress had already repealed the embargo. Madison's solution to the problem was a law that allowed merchants to trade with any country except France and Britain. Trading with these countries would start again when they agreed to respect the United States ships, but this law proved no more effective than the embargo. So, the British support of Native American resistance. It says the British interference with American shipping and impressment of the United States made Americans furious. They were angered by Britain's actions in the Northwest. Many settlers believed that the British were stirring up Native American resistance to frontier settlements. Since the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, Native Americans continued to lose their land. Thousands of white settlers had swarmed into Ohio and then into Indiana. Tecumseh, a Shawnee chief, vowed to stop the loss of Native American land. He believed that the reason Native Americans continued to lose their land was because they were separated into many different tribes. He concluded that Native Americans had to do what white Americans had done, unite. Events in 1809 proved him right. That September, William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory, signed the Treaty of Fort Wayne with chiefs of the Miami, Delaware, and Potawatomi tribes. They agreed to sell over 3 million acres of land, but Tecumseh declared the treaty meaningless. After the Treaty of Fort Wayne, many Native Americans began to answer his call for unity, but his efforts ultimately failed. In November 1811, while Tecumseh was recruiting tribes for his alliance, the Shawnee were defeated by Harrison's forces at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and it was a severe setback for his movement. And another big major cause is going to be the Warhawks. We're going to have leaders such as Congressman Henry Clay of Kentucky, who was angry and demanded war against Britain. Westerners who called for war was known as Warhawks. They wanted British aid to Native Americans stopped, and they wanted the British out of Canada. Conquering Canada would open up a vast new empire for Americans. Other Americans sought war because of the British violations of Americans' rights at sea. The future president, Andrew Jackson, said, hostilities were necessary for the protection of our maritime citizens impressed on board British ships of war and to open a market for the productions of outsoil. Urged on by Jackson and the Warhawks, Congress declared war on Britain on June 18, 1812. So we can say that a lot of the major causes of the war go back to the British seizing the United States sailors by impressment, which is pretty much like kidnapping. Um, the fact that they had British restrictions on United States trade with France. Um, Another big cause is Britain's support for the Indians on the frontier. And the fact that we had our pro war Congress, which were known as the War Hawks, that were pretty much ready to go to war. So you need to answer the two questions. State at least two causes that will lead to the War of 1812. So you can go back to that chart. Or based on what you just heard me say. And then it says, do you think that causes mentioned are good enough reasons to go to war? So do you feel yes or no, and why? So it says, was war ever inevitable? The United States and Britain drifted closer to war as the security of American ships remained an issue. The British continued to board American ships and press American seamen. To cut off American trade with France, British warships blockaded some American ports in May 1811 near New York Harbor. A brief battle broke out between an American frigate and a British warship. The Americans crippled the British ship and left 32 British sailors dead or wounded. The War Hawks urged Congress to prepare for war. Others in Congress disagreed. John Randolph of Virginia warned that the people of the United States would not submit to be taxed for this war of conquest and dominion. Representatives of New England were especially concerned. They feared that the British Navy would attack New England seaports. So, what exactly happened at the beginning of the war? The American declaration of war took the British by surprise. They were locked in a bitter struggle with Napoleon and could not spare troops to fight the United States. As the war began, however, the United States faced difficulties of its own. The difficulties of building a military. The United States was not ready for war because remember, Thomas Jefferson had reduced the spending on defense. The Navy had only 16 ships to meet the huge British fleet. The Army was small and badly equipped, and many of the officers knew little about warfare. These problems made it difficult to maintain national security. Since there were few regular troops, the government relied on volunteers. Congress voted to give them a bounty of cash and land. Surprising victories at sea. The British Navy blockaded American ports to stop American trade. Though unable to break the blockade, several American sea captains won stunning victories. One famous battle took place early in the war in August 1812. As he was sailing near Newfoundland, Isaac Hull, captain of the USS Constitution, spotted the British ship HMS Guerriere. For nearly an hour, the two ships fought for position. At last, the guns of the Constitution roared into action. They tore holes into the sides of the ship and shot off both masts. Stunned, the British captain had no choice but to surrender. American sea captains won other victories at sea. These victories cheered Americans but did little to win the war. It says, fourth, the war with Canada. One goal of the War Hawks was to conquer Canada. They were convinced that Canadians would welcome the chance to throw off British rule and join the United States. General William Hull moved American troops into Canada from Detroit. The Canadians had only a few untrained troops to ward off the invasion. However, they were led by a clever British general, Isaac Brock. Brock paraded his soldiers in red coats to make it appear that experienced British troops were helping the Canadians. He also led Americans to think that a large number of Native Americans were fighting alongside the Canadians. His scare tactics worked. Hoare retreated from Canada, and other attempts to invade Canada also failed. However, on April 27, 1813, U.S. soldiers crossed Lake Ontario and successfully captured York, which is today present day Toronto. The Americans seized the British guns and supplies, and they set fire to public buildings. So in 1813, the Americans, armed with the guns and supplies they had seized at York, set out to win control of Lake Erie. Captain Oliver Hazard Perry had no fleet, so he designed and built his own ships. In September 1813, he sailed his tiny fleet against the British. During the Battle of Lake Erie, the British battered Perry's own ship and left it helpless. Perry rowed over to another American ship and continued to fight. Finally, the Americans won the battle. Captain Perry wrote his message of victory on the back of an envelope. We have met the enemy, and they are ours. So let's watch this little clip.
These sandy shores are
So that's just a little insight of Lake Erie. So it says, how did the War of 1812 end? The Native American losses in the War of 1812. It says, after losing control of Lake Erie, the British and their ally, Tecumseh, retreated from Detroit into Canada. General William Henry Harrison, veteran of Tippecanoe, pursued them. The Americans won a decisive victory at the Battle of Thames. Tecumseh died in the fighting. Without his leadership, the Indian Confederation soon fell apart. While Tecumseh was defeated in Canada, some sections of the Creeks continued their fight against the United States settlers in the South. Andrew Jackson, a Tennessee officer, took command of American troops in the Creek War. In March 1814, with the help of the Cherokees, the Choctaws, and the Friendly Creeks, Jackson won a crushing victory at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. The leader of the enemy, Creeks, walked alone into Jackson's camp to surrender. "Your people have destroyed my nation," he said. The burning of Washington and victory in Baltimore. In the spring of 1814, Britain and its allies defeated France. With the war in Europe over, Britain could send more troops and ships against the United States. In August 1814, the British ships sailed into Chesapeake Bay and landed an invasion force about 30 miles from Washington, D.C. American troops met the British in Maryland. As President Madison watched, the battle hardened, and British quickly scattered the untrained Americans. The British met little further resistance on their march to the capital. In the White House, First Lady Dolly Madison waited for her husband to return. Hastily, she scrawled a letter to a note to her sister. "Will you believe it, my sister? We have had a battle or skirmish near Bladensburg, and here I am still within sound of the cannon. Mr. Madison comes not. May God protect us. Two messengers covered with dust come bid me fly. But here I mean to wait for him. Dolly Madison." Soon after the British troops marched into the capital, Dolly Madison gathered up important papers of the president and a portrait of George Washington. Then she fled south. She was not there to see the British set fire to the White House and other buildings. The British considered this an act of revenge for the burning of York. From Washington, the British marched toward the city of Baltimore. The key to Baltimore's defense was Fort McHenry on Baltimore Harbor. From the evening of September 13 until dawn on September 14, the Battle of Baltimore, British rockets bombarded the harbor. So this is how we are going to see the fact that they are going to set Washington, D.C. on fire. So let me see. Thought it was on this one. No. Okay. So they are going to set Washington D.C., our capital, on fire, and because of Dolly Madison, she was able to gather up some very important papers of her husband, and she was able to get that portrait that was hanging of George Washington. So let's watch this little insight on Dolly Madison.
James Madison was
So she's very, very significant. You know, a little bit of insight, on August 24th, 1814, that's when the British troops are going to set fire to the building during the War of 1812. The only thing that kept it from complete destruction was that there was a rainstorm, and that kept it from being completely destroyed. Um, so they did have to rebuild the White House, because remember, it's still not completely finished yet. They were still working on it, and you know they're going to have to reconstruct this unfinished house, um, for obviously the president. It says, "Who won the Battle of Baltimore?" When the early morning fog lifted, the broad stripes and bright stars of the American flag still waved over Fort McHenry. American forces had won the Battle of Baltimore. The British withdrew and the threat to the nation's capital ended. Francis Scott Key, a young American lawyer who witnessed the battle, wrote a poem about it. Soon his poem, The Star-Spangled Banner, was published and set to music. Today, it is the national anthem of the United States. Success in New Orleans makes Jackson a hero. In late 1814, the British prepared to attack New Orleans. From there, they hoped to sail up to the Mississippi. However, Andrew Jackson was waiting. Jackson had turned his frontier fighters into a strong army. He took Pensacola and Spanish Florida to keep the British from using it as a base. He then marched through Mobile and set up camps in New Orleans. Jackson's force included thousands of frontiersmen and Choctaws. The Choctaws were longtime rivals of the Indian nations who had been allied with the French. Many of Jackson's troops were expert riflemen. Citizens of New Orleans also joined the army to defend their city from the British. Among the volunteers were hundreds of African Americans. It says, the war's conclusion. What? We fought the Battle of New Orleans for nothing? The American soldiers dug trenches to defend themselves. On January 8th, 1815, the British attacked. Again and again, British soldiers marched toward these American trenches. More than 2,000 British fell under the deadly fire of American sharpshooters and especially American cannons. Only 7 Americans died. Americans cheered the victory at the Battle of New Orleans. Overnight, Andrew Jackson became a national hero. His fame did not dim even when Americans learned that the battle had taken place 2 weeks after the war ended. The United States and Britain had already signed a treaty in Europe, but news took 2 months to cross the ocean by sail and had not reached the United States. So they actually fought and the war had already ended. So this is from the Battle of New Orleans.
The War of 1812 is a story.
So definitely not a forgotten war. So it says on here, explain what happened to the White House and why. Obviously, well, I was going to say the answer, but go back and, who was involved and what was the purpose for what they did to the White House. And how is it that Andrew Jackson is going to become a hero? And what battle or what exactly did he do? So make sure you type in your answer there. So the effects of the war. What happened after the War of 1812? While Madison did not want war, other Americans were not as cautious. In New England, anti war feelings ran strong. However, members of Congress from the South and the West called for war. They were known as war hawks. By late 1814, Americans knew that peace talks had begun, but they did not know if they would succeed or how long they would last. As Jackson was preparing to fight the British at New Orleans, New Englanders were meeting to protest Mr. Madison's war. New Englanders protest economic instability. The British blockade had hurt New England's sea trade. Also, many New Englanders feared that the United States might win land in Florida and Canada. If new states were carved out of these lands, the South and the West would become more influential than New England. Delegates from around New England met at Hartford, Connecticut in December 1814. Most were Federalists, and they disliked the Democratic Republican president and the war. So some delegates to the Hartford Convention threatened to nullify or cancel the state of war in their states if the war continued. Others threatened to leave the Union. Then, while the delegates debated what to do, news of the peace treaty arrived. The Hartford Convention ended quickly. With the war over, the protest was meaningless. In the end, the threat of secession further weakened the dying Federalist Party. A peace treaty was signed in the city of Ghent in present-day Belgium on December 24, 1814. John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, our second president, and one of the American delegates summed up the Treaty of Ghent in one sentence. Nothing was adjusted, nothing was settled. Britain and the United States agreed to restore pre-war conditions. The treaty said nothing about impressment or neutrality. These issues had faded due to the end of the wars in Europe. Other issues were settled later. In 1818, for example, the two nations settled a dispute over the border between Canada and the United States. So the Treaty of Ghent is what's going to end. It's going to end the war, and it's going to end as neutral. In other words, nothing is gained and nothing is lost. It says, looking back, some Americans felt that the War of 1812 had been a mistake. Others argued that Europe would now treat the young republic with more respect. The victories of heroes like Oliver Hazard Perry, William Henry Harrison, and Andrew Jackson gave Americans new pride in their country. As one Democratic Republican leader remarked, the people are now more American. They feel and act more as a nation. So this is when it's talking about when it's saying that quote, this is what we're talking about: nationalism, having pride in our country. Kind of like, when the sad, tragic events of 9/11 happened, our country became more united. They came together because now we were being attacked here in our country. So it says, what was the Hartford Convention? So go back and type in your response. Go back to the slide and explain what the Treaty of Ghent fixed or did not fix. So make sure you answer both of those questions. Now, the next important thing that we're going to talk about is going to be our Star Spangled Banner, and basically know the history about it. So now every time, we listen to our national anthem, you can make a relation to, well, what exactly happened. And I'm moving forward on the slides just to see where exactly I am at. So it says, Francis Scott Key was a well-known 34-year-old Washington, D.C. lawyer poet. The British had captured Washington, and taken William Beanes, a physician, prisoner. They were holding him aboard the ship in their fleet off the Baltimore shore. Friends of Beanes persuaded Key to negotiate his release. Key went out to the British fleet and succeeded in gaining Beanes' release, but because the British planned to attack Baltimore at that time, they were both detained. During the night of September 13th through the 14th, Francis Scott Key watched the bombardment of Baltimore from the deck of a British ship. Although rain obscured the fort during the night, at daybreak he could see the American flag still flying from Fort McHenry. The fort stood still after the British had fired some 1,800 bombs, rockets, and shells at it, about 400 of them landing inside. 4 defenders were killed and 24 wounded. Key drafted the words of a poem on an envelope. The American detainees were sent ashore, the British fleet withdrew, and Key finished the poem and made a good copy of it in Baltimore hotel the next day. Let's watch this little clip.
I was a lawyer once. His name was Francis Scott Key. He did his said we're going to remove it from the face of the earth. He said, how are we going to do that? He said, if you will stand on the earth and you will see it as he looked. He could see hundreds of little ants. And he said, that's the entire thing. He said, I live in value. It's not a thing. And he said, he said, the worst of it. He said, you can see he said, do you see that flag? He said,
I think, after listening to the video, it should give you, every time you listen to the lyrics um, from Francis Scott Key, um, you can kind of visualize, what it is that he was seeing. Because remember, he was on a mission to pretty much win the release of a friend who had been arrested and was being held on a British ship. Um, so even though he had successfully persuaded the British to release his friend, um, Key was on the British vessel, and his friend had already overheard that they were going to attack Fort McHenry. Um, so what happened is they didn't want them to leave, and they give out this information. So the British kept Francis Scott Key, and his friend under guard until the assault actually happened aboard the British fleet. Um, so as the day had already turned to darkness, the barrage of weapons that were directed at Fort McHenry, they overwhelmed Key. And the sky was turning fiery red. He was positive that there's no way the Americans are going to defeat the British here. And the bombardment happened, and the barrage against the fort had stopped sometime during the night. And then, as the sun slowly begins to rise again and the sky starts to clear, you know, they see that the American flag is still, still up. It's still standing. It was still there. So this was definitely a huge signal that it was an American victory. And this is why, as Francis Scott Key is on board, this British ship, he began to write a few lines as far as noting down what it is that he was witnessing. So using the back of a letter from his pocket, this is how he started writing his poem. And then sooner or later, his poem was actually put into the newspapers using a title, "The Defense of Fort McHenry," because remember that's where they were at. And sooner or later, the Star Spangled Banner started gaining popularity, and even in the Civil War, they started using it. Bands began playing it at the 4th of July ceremonies. And it's not until 1916 that President Woodrow Wilson is actually going to say that it has to be played at a military and other appropriate occasions, sporting events, etc. So Congress is going to eventually pass a bill in 1931 that's going to recognize the Star Spangled Banner as our national anthem. And that's why today it is very common to hear it before the start of sporting events, or especially like in the Olympics when, we win a gold medal. Um, if you're on a U.S. military base, you hear it at the end of each day, especially on the 4th of July. So the writer of the Star Spangled Banner is Francis Scott Key. And remember, he's forced to stay on the British ship because he had overheard that attack against Fort McHenry, because that is the fort that was being attacked. So for them to be able to see the flag was still flying above the fort meant that it had definitely been an American victory. So very, very powerful. It's so now I know it says to click the flag to read about a situation that happened. Civil rights protests have never been popular. Activists can't persuade their contemporaries. They're aiming at the next generation. It says one common response to the national anthem protest originated by Colin Kaepernick is to disparage them as polarizing. It says the idea here is that kneeling NFL players are committing an act of such blatant disrespect that they hand Trump an easy image which to Sorry, I lost my line. Where am I? Sorry. It says, often attendant to the idea that protesting players are shooting themselves in the foot is the notion that in some era, black protests proved to be a unifying force that altered the psychology of some critical mass of open-minded whites. It says, David Leonhardt offers a version of this in Monday New York Times. In one of his first prominent speeches during the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of the glory of America, with all its faults. At the March on Washington, King described not just a dream, but a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. Before finishing, he recited the first 7 lines of My Country, This of Thee, ending with Let Freedom Ring. A year and a half later, marches from Selma to Montgomery carried American flags. Segregationist hecklers along the route held up Confederate flags. Within 6 months, Lyndon Johnson had signed the Voting Rights Act. Leonhardt goes on to contrast the species of activism which aligned the civil rights movement with the symbols and ideas of America. With kneeling during the national anthem, which presumably signals opposition to those same symbols, he says it is sympathetic to the aims of Kaepernick's protest, but he contrasts this angry approach with the smart approach of the civil rights movement. It says there's a lot of ground covered in this column and not all of it thoroughly. So basically it goes on, and today is Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And this whole controversy that has definitely ignited with people kneeling for the flag or all of that. I mean, it's left to everybody's type of interpretation, whether you feel that they are taking a good position on, hey, I'm going to take a knee during the sporting events, or I'm not going to take a knee. There's been a lot of talk about our national anthem, and then, of course, people's First Amendment rights about, well, I can do this. This is my way of, protesting or whatnot. But how do you feel about the situation when you start to see athletes or important, anybody starting to take a knee during sporting events, anytime they start to hear about our national anthem? What are your thoughts on this? Do you think it's right? Do you think they have a good reason? Or do you think that it's disrespectful to take a knee every time we hear the national anthem? So what I want you to do is make sure you click a response, and when you are done listening to my presentation, I want you to go on your assignments, and before you click turn in, I want you to comment, like send me a private comment and put MLK Day. MLK Day. Now, don't tell your classmates that I'm telling you that you have to type that in the private comment, because this is going to tell me who listened to my presentation today while I was out and who didn't. Obviously, if students are not putting MLK Day as a private comment, I'm going to know that they did not listen to anything from my podcast today on our president, James Madison. So make sure that you do that so that I can just verify that you were listening. But basically, in his presidency, his we are going to go to war. And with the War of 1812, there's the causes, the British in seizing the U.S. sailors through impressment, the restrictions on the United States trade with France, the fact that the British were getting support for the Indians, The war hawks, they were pro-war. And of course, some of the main events throughout this, the British trade blockade, the burning of Washington, D.C., um, the failed invasions of Canada. And remember, the Treaty of Ghent is what's going to bring this to an end, even though it ended as neutral in the end. It was nothing gained, nothing lost. Remember that Francis Scott Key is going to write the Star Spangled Banner after he witnesses the attack of Fort Henry. Andrew Jackson defeats the British at the Battle of New Orleans. He is applauded as a war hero. And the effects of this all is that we are going to get that confirmation of U.S. independence, that nationalism, that pride. So the main significance is this war between America and Britain establishes the United States as a country with an identity when the new country defended its first invasion, proving that, hey, we're still the powerful force. So even though no territory was gained and lost and there was no clear winner, it did prove to all the other countries that, hey, we're not going to stand back. We're not going to take this from anybody. All right, make sure that you do click submit once you're done, and don't forget what I told you to type as a private comment.